Okay. So we talked a bit about how to do multiple keyword searching, how to implement that. We talked a little bit about deferred execution and how that fits into the picture as far as building queries up dynamically. What we want to talk now about is the autocomplete features that are actually built into the browsers nowadays, and what's available there. Because there's a few things there. We want to know what's already available, to know what we don't really need to build ourselves, what it's better to let the browser just take care of, as well as knowing what are some of those alternatives that we can use that are already there for simple cases, and knowing also, because when we do the more advanced things, we're going to have to turn these features off. If I want to be able to use the more advanced autocomplete features, I need to actually turn this stuff off to use that, because otherwise they're both going to be there, and that's going to be a problem for usability. So that's the other reason why we need to talk about this. So there's two terms that come up a lot of times when we're talking about autocomplete, and they're kind of easily confused because they're really, really close. So one is autocomplete and the other is autofill. Okay, they sound very similar, but there is some distinction between the two. Okay, so autocomplete is what happens as I'm typing and it's suggesting things. Autocomplete happens as you're typing things in. Autofill, on the other hand, that is, say you go to a registration form and your street address is already filled in. The browser has already gone and filled it in. And you remember, usually that will then turn the field some sort of variant of yellow, right? Is usually when it's been autofilled, and the form field will usually turn yellow. That's what that is. So autofill is it automatically filling in a bunch of fields for you, whether it's because it automatically did it when you loaded the page, such as with your login information, or if you just clicked a button and it said, oh, okay, you want to put your address in here, and it says, okay, I've got your address saved, I'll go put your address in these 5 fields. Does that make sense? So that's what autofill is. But autocomplete is just saying, okay, I can kind of guess what you're wanting to type. Is this what you mean? You know, you started to type your email address. Is this the email address you want to type? And it'll suggest the rest of the string. Okay, that's kind of the difference. Is autofill is going ahead and filling in the values for you, versus autocomplete is suggesting how to finish what you've already started typing. Okay, the reason, we kind of read something here, they'll kind of talk about the reason that we have these things. This is from an article called Help Users Check Out with Autofill, which actually was written by somebody at Google. Fair forewarning, there's some interesting stuff in this article. It's also very out of date. So if you read, there's some guidance in this article about how to make autocomplete work that is actually old and doesn't work anymore, because things have changed recently in the past 2 years. So this is, I think, was written in 2015 or so, and things have changed since then. But the reason for doing it hasn't. So we say, the way he kind of writes it here says, people hate filling out web forms, especially on mobile devices. They can be slow and frustrating to complete. This leads to a high user drop-off and frustration. But to help make things easier for users, browsers have long been able to autocomplete fields on behalf of the user. Chrome took this step further in 2011 by introducing what they now call autofill, which fills in entire forms based on the user's autofill profile. So part of the reason that this exists is because typing on mobile devices is a pain. So you want to reduce how much typing the user has. So the better your autocomplete works on your website, your mobile websites, the better it's going to be. You got a hand up, Eston? Huh?
So is it you're going to show us the new way how to do with the autocomplete and autofill?
Yes. Okay. So what I'm saying is, the new way to do it is really close to this, but what's in that article was before it was standardized. So this at that time was what Google had decided to do with Chrome, But back in 2015, every browser did this differently. So what's changed is that in 2017 we got some standards finally, where it's officially part of the HTML5.2 spec as to how autocomplete, how to specify these things in HTML now. So we'll go through some of those things from that spec. That make sense? So, but the reason we're doing this is to make the process easier for users. The other thing that this helps is actually, if we get it right, it reduces how many errors that we have, right? So if they don't have to type in their address every time, they're less likely to type in the incorrect address. That makes sense? If they don't have to type it into every website they do, every website they go to, they just have it saved. That makes that easier. However, if we leave it as a default and we don't do anything, oftentimes, especially with credit card things or address things, the defaults don't work in a lot of browsers in a lot of cases. Where, like, I've seen a lot of websites where, okay, you can put in your card number, or you can scan your card, but it won't correctly take the expiration date and the other pieces, or your name. That makes sense? Because we haven't properly hinted at where to put those things. And similar thing with street address, if you set this up incorrectly, then you end up with them putting the city and the state address, the state field, and the state and the city, or you end up with things going into the wrong fields. Does that make sense? So we always want to do this, regardless of whether or not it seems like it's working in a particular browser, because we're trying to give it a hint as to what does this field mean, so that it leads to less errors. Okay? If we don't do this, we're likely to get more errors, versus if we do this, we're likely to reduce errors. Because your users are going to use autocomplete whether or not you want them to. So originally, the thing that got originally this got added to HTML5 several years back, this autocomplete attribute. But originally when it got added, there were only two options, on or off. And by default, everything in HTML, and this is still the case, it's defaulted to on. Autocomplete is on for any input field you have on your website. That's straight up the default. So if you want to change it, you have to do something as a developer. Okay? So one thing we can do is we can say off. I want to say, I don't want the browser to remember this field, and I don't want it to suggest a value there. That's what happens if I say autocomplete off. That make sense? And that works for most things, with the exception of login information. In fact, Chrome goes out of its way to ignore that. So if you have a username and password field, even if you marked it autocomplete off, Chrome will still fill it in. Okay. So there is some stuff that you have to do if you want to specifically prevent that. But autocomplete off is kind of that simplest first step. And in fact, that's what we're going to end up using on our search box when we get our own search interface working. We're going to say autocomplete off because we don't want to use the browser's interface. We're going to use our own. But that's all there was initially. Okay, up until 2017, when 5.2 HTML 5.2 came up, that was the only options that you could rely on in any browser, is autocomplete on, autocomplete off. So what changed in 5.2 is the W3C put together a standard of things that can go in this autocomplete attribute that aren't on or off. Okay? And what we call those autofill field names or autofill field tokens. Okay? That's what the standard calls them. Okay? Tokens or names is what you'll see in there. So until recently there wasn't a standard for that. 5.2's kind of changed that. It was originally on and off. So for instance, according to the new spec, if I say that autocomplete equals organization, well, what I'm saying is, okay, what should go here? We're giving it a hint as to what the browser should autofill into that field. So organization would be company name corresponding to the person, address, or contact information in the fields associated. Does that make sense? So if you're filling out a resume and you have 3 companies, right? Well, maybe you have a field that you need to specify the company name. Well, we would say autocomplete organization. And that's going to help them get the work history in there auto-completed in the right way. So organization is one of those. The way that looks kind of in code, you see I've got this autocomplete tag here. Okay. I would really, really recommend going ahead and reading this article that I pulled this from. It's called What Web Devs Should Know But Don't. There's a lot of information that people aren't necessarily aware of that's come about recently with changes to autofill. So I definitely recommend add that to something you read through, because there's a lot of good information in that article about what that means and things you can do with that. Another thing that's in there, so you can put names in there, but it's also not just one thing. You can actually put a space-separated list of tokens into this autocomplete attribute now. So for instance, oftentimes when you're checking out, your checkout's usually going to have 2 things, a shipping address and a billing address, right? And if I just put, okay, street address, city, state, country, postal code, zip code, if I just put those as that was all I had in autocomplete, then it wouldn't really be able to keep track of what's your shipping address and what's your billing address, right? And it would get mishmashed. So what they've added is you can add additional words in here. So for instance here, we can say shipping, street address, shipping, yada yada. So we add in the word shipping here, and that tells us that this group of fields is for their shipping address. We use the same thing with the billing. We just change this word here to billing. Okay? Now there's some interesting things in these tokens, okay? Because they might not be what you expect. Okay? So let's look at what we have here. So we have the address. This is going to be the street address. We have the city, the state, the country, and the postal, and the zip code, right? So those are the fields that are here. But notice what the autocomplete tokens are. So for the street address, we've got street address, right? Which, whether or not that should be street address is up for debate. But that is what street address here. They've actually made it a text area, which means that you can put lines 1, 2, and 3 all in that one field. That makes sense? So if it's Suite 200, you just push enter and fill that into that text area. Makes sense? Rather than having separate fields. So if you're going to do that all in one field, you do that as street address. There's actually a different type that you want to use if you're going to use it as, if you're going to say line 1, line 2, line 3, and break them up as separate fields. So we use a different one for that. Now, what gets interesting here, you see we've got city. You see this is address level 2. It's an address level 2. And we've got country, or sorry, state is address level 1. Okay? It's not state and city as those tokens. Why might they have done that way? Any thoughts?
Because different countries don't have states.
Right? And different countries don't necessarily have cities in the same way that we do. Right? So, in fact, if you look at their formal documentation, one of the things that they say, well, for address level 1, here in the US it's states. In Switzerland it's something they call a canton, which is really close to a state. It's basically effectively the same thing, but it's at a smaller scale, and they just have a different name for it. Right? So that's a lot of the reason why those names may be a little bit funky, is because they're trying to make this work for any country out there. So rather than calling it city and state, we call it address level 1, address level 2, address level 3. So address level 1 is going to be for the US, that's the state. Address level 2 is our city. Okay. Country name, you have what shows up here, shipping country. There's actually two different entries. If you look at the table, there's one that's country and there's one that's country name. Country would be just the country code, if I remember right, versus country name is the full spelled out. So if we say country name here, it should be United States. Whereas if it was just the country code, we'd expect to see it as US. Does that make sense? There's not a distinction between like the state code versus the full name of the state. They don't distinguish between those two as far as autofill is concerned. Okay, and zip code is specifically called postal code. The reason we do that is postal code is a little bit more generic as far as globally. Zip code's a very specifically an American thing. Versus postal code, most countries have a postal code. It just functions differently. So let's look at some of that's what an address field might look like. That's what billing might look like. Let's look at some of these fields more in depth. So for instance, the login information, we've got a few options here. So username is username, email is email, tel is telephone. You'll notice here there's something very interesting with these two, with the current password and the new password. Okay? So current password says this is a field where you can autofill whatever the user's current password is. But we've also got new password for when you need to change the password, right? So if you do a password reset, right, you don't want it to go automatically fill what the current password is. Does that make sense? Because we want to change it, okay? Or if I want to register a new account, I'm going to mark that password field and the confirm password field as new password because I'm assuming that the user wants to create a new password for that website. That makes sense? So new password, current password. So if I actually want to prevent autofill on a password field, which you use as new password, not off. Does that make sense? So off doesn't work anymore as far as preventing the autocomplete there, but new password does, because that's what it's intended for. On a similar side, you've got this thing called one-time code. One-time code would be like a security code you get from your phone or things like that. Send you a text message to make sure that you're actually who you are, or send you an email and put in that code to verify that's who you are. So that's out there. So this is as far as controlling how things work in Chrome for autofilling passwords and security keys. These are really, really important tools to have in your toolbox because that's how you have to do things nowadays. One issue that I've run into, and this is where different technologies, have some ups and downs. Because of the flexibility of MVC, right? As far as MVC framework is concerned, we can put anything we want for the autocomplete tag, right? Which is nice because when standards like this change, we're freely able to change that, right? Versus if you were using if you're using ASP.NET Forms, or if you're using SharePoint, actually, I ran into the problem that I couldn't put new password in there because they tied my hands in terms of actually writing the tags. I couldn't write the HTML myself for it. Does that make sense? So that's one upside of using a technology like MVC over Windows Forms, is when things like this change, you can adapt, right? The more flexibility, the more ability you have to write the HTML yourself, the better you can deal with things like this that occur. And it's like, okay, now I need to put something in there that wasn't in there when this language was written, right? When this tool was written. Similar for credit cards, this is a very common thing that occurs. Anytime you want to buy something, you're probably going to have to put some credit card information. So you've got a field for the cardholder name, which is CC name, for the credit card number, CC number, expiration month and expiration year, and the security card. As long as you put those autocomplete values on your input fields, great. It'll autofill. All the stuff works.
Does that do anything as far as validation?
It doesn't do anything as far as validation. You still have to do the validation yourself on that front. But what it does do is, for instance, if you go to a website and it gives you the option to scan your card or load up a card that you've already entered, by applying these autocomplete types, that's what makes that work. And that's what makes it work well. So that then you can just say, oh, well, just use the card I used to buy something on this other website, and done. You just hit go for a save card. If you don't apply this stuff, then it doesn't work nearly as well.
How secure stuff like that?
That's a good question, right? And that's the other reason why this stuff exists, because as far as autocomplete's concerned, typically most browsers apply a broad strategy where they save nearly everything that you put into a form, pretty much anything, into any field, and that's usually saved as plain text. Most of the stuff that you put in online is going to be saved as plain text on your computer. So that does become a security risk, right? Which is the other reason why these exist. Because now if I say that this is a current password, I'm telling it this is sensitive information, right? It now knows that's a password. I shouldn't save that in an unencrypted format. Does that make sense? Because I've told it this, now the browser can figure out, okay, I should probably save this in an encrypted format instead of saving as plain text. Similar thing with one-time code. It knows, well, that's a sensitive thing. It's only used once. I don't need to save that value. Does that make sense? So if you mark it as one-time code, it's not going to save that value.
Does a form have like a hidden field and have like still have like the autocomplete with the password?
Yes, you can still have it go into a
Wouldn't that be a security
hidden
risk?
field. Yeah. Yes, it would be, and it still happens. Let's come back to that because I've got a page about login information,
Right.
because it's kind of a complicated mess at the moment. But by putting these types on there, not only do I make the autofill work, but I also tell it that this is sensitive information that you shouldn't just save, like something I saved into, a contact form or something like that. I should treat it as credit card information and treat it as sensitive, right? Does that make sense? So you're enabling it to also do things like that where it saves it in an encrypted format. But if we don't do that, we just leave autocomplete off of all of our fields, it's going to save your credit card information in an unsecure fashion.
There's, I guess, words or searches for keywords kind of that,
Well,
or tags or something.
Remember, all of this is we say autocomplete equals CC name. It has to be exactly that, CC dash name. So as long as we do or CC dash number. If we say autocomplete is that, then it knows to treat that specially. Okay. Now, not every browser will treat that the same way. Not every browser will treat that with the same security level. So as far as how that credit card information is saved is going to be different between Chrome and Firefox and IE or Opera. All of those are going to save that information differently. So the kind of security constraints that you have is going to be on a browser basis, right? But this allows them, once you do that, now they know this data is special, and so they can, if they've got support for it, they can treat it specially. One thing I've run into, I do use a tool in Chrome called LastPass to save my passwords. It completely ignores the autocomplete attribute. Completely, and I've noticed this doing a lot of things. So it won't pay attention to any of this. I hope that they change that in the near future, but LastPass just completely ignores that, unfortunately. So the only thing that LastPass looks at is the name and the ID of your fields. It doesn't, and the types, but it doesn't actually look at what the autocomplete type is, which is unfortunate. Which also means that new password doesn't work for LastPass because it ignores it.
So does LastPass like store that all in the database somewhere?
So the upside is LastPass stores it on the cloud rather than storing it locally. So there's some nicety there. But that's the thing you have to keep in mind. So there may be, you've got the autocomplete and autofilled settings on their browser. Some people have plugins like LastPass or other things. That's not the only thing that's out there. They may also have a plugin that's doing autofill. And then you may have to work with both of those things to make them happy, right? So if I have LastPass on my browser, it's going to be LastPass as well as Chrome's autofill that I'm working with as a web developer and making sure that both of those things work and do the right thing, not just one or the other. So there's some other form fields. You can go through that. And one thing to pay attention to, and this is where that other article written by Google is old, specifically deals with names. So if you want a full name, that autocomplete type is just name. Full name is just name. If I want a first name, it's not first name, it's not F name. It used to be the Chrome saw that as F name and L name. That's first and last name. Nowadays it's given name and family name. So your first name is given name, your last name is family name. Okay? Do you know why that might be? Why might they use that instead of first name, last name?
I know in some cultures the family name comes first.
It's true. Does anybody know what cultures those are?
I believe it's the Asian nations like China, Korea, and Japan.
Yeah, a lot of them do, as well as India, actually. It's not uncommon in India to do that way as well, where your family name comes first and is your first name, and then your last name is actually your given name. Okay, so that happens in some cultures where your first name and your last name are not the same as when you treat them. And so oftentimes it's worth saving that data if you really want to be sensitive to that and internationally sensitive. You call things family name and given name because that works across cultures and it's much more clear about what's what rather than treating it as first and last. That makes sense. First and last works fine as long as you only have US customers. And then additional name would be your middle name, which the other thing to know about, are you aware that there are cultures in the world that have more than 3 names? In fact, there's somebody that I know, I think he was born in Kenya, and he's got 10 names? So he's got a family name that's all the way at the end, and he's got a kind of a given name that's in the beginning, but there's a lot of names in between there that has to do with his lineage. So basically he's got a lot of family names in there. So this additional name might not be just one word. And keep that in mind as you're sizing your columns. Don't just say, okay, well, we've got 10 characters for my middle name and assume that's enough. Because there's plenty of people out there in the world that may need 100 characters to really type out their middle name.
I got 2 middle names.
Huh?
I got 2 middle names.
Uh-huh. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Nickname is also one thing out there. A lot of websites don't ask for your nickname, but that's a good thing to do as far as being culturally sensitive, because what you can put in nickname is you say, what do you want me to call you? Because some people go by one of their middle names, some people go by their first name, some people may go by something else. So if you put nickname in there, then you also know what to call them. Okay. You got organization we talked about. Organization title would be your role. So if you're looking at job history, those are two great ways to specify that out. Your company and your title would be organization and organization title. So there's a lot of things in there to look at. Another one that sometimes comes up, and I think we were running in this and Learn to Earn. I don't remember if I made this change already. Birthday is actually B-Day. One of the few ones that's acronyms. It's like shorthanded, right? It's not birth date, it's not DOB, it's not date of birth, it's B-Day. Is your birthday. And if you look at the spec, actually there's a few different ones of these. So B-Day is your full birthday, but if you were going to break it down into separate fields, so you had a year, a month, and a day field, it'd be like B-Day-year, B-Day-month, B-Day-day is the way it. There's actually some more, a lot of these break out where there's here put all the things in one field, or if you want to break it up into separate fields, then it's this, and that. So if you look at here's kind of the official table. You can go follow that link. That will give you all the full list of things that are out there, as well as if you, MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, has a page about it as well that's maybe a little bit easier to read on that front. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there. Several of those things are on your homework. What's what? I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I pulled that in from the official documentation.
I'm guessing that's like another gender identity from a different culture.
Probably.
There's a few cultures that have more than two.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you look at the whole list of things that can go in gender, it's a very long list. So So that is, so that's if I want to use just standard autocomplete. These are the fields that exist on most websites, and you don't necessarily want to type in again. However, that doesn't cover everything in the world, right? So, okay, address is understood, email is understood, but what about your favorite pasta? Right? If I want your favorite pasta, well, I'm not going to get some good autocomplete from the browser. Does that make sense? It's not going to have support for that. So if I want to have autocomplete for your favorite pasta, I'm going to need to do that myself. Sorry. So the way we can do that is we use something called a data list. So this is a data list here. We've got that and a tag. A data list, it looks a lot like what? What does this look like? What have you seen before that has option tags in it? Looks a lot like a select tag, right? So data list looks a lot like a select tag. You have option tags in here. In fact, you can also put value on there if you want the value to be something different than what shows up in the dropdown. But if you just leave it there, that's what we select. So as I'm typing in here for my favorite pasta, it will automatically figure out, okay, you typed in K-A-N? Oh, do you mean cannelloni? And it'll suggest that. So this works really well for any time you have a very small list of options that you can suggest to the user. So for instance, if I'm talking about states, this is really good, right? Because I can provide a data list that's got all 50 states in it. As they start typing in Missouri, it will automatically say, oh, well, do you mean Mississippi or Missouri as soon as I get to MI, right? So this is very good for a lot of things like that, where it's just, hey, okay, you want to, I know what the values are going to be up ahead of time. It's not based on the data in the database. Here you go.
Can you type in something other than one of the options?
Yes. Yes. So this still lets you type in anything that's not on that list. So if I wanted to type in linguine that's not on this list, I could still type in linguine. It just won't suggest the spelling for it. Does that make sense? So this is built right in HTML. You don't have to use any JavaScript to make this work. This just works. No JavaScript, no Bootstrap required. Done, you have an autocomplete. So for simple cases, this is a great tool. Okay? And it's even possible to use this. Let's say you want to have the user kind of pick an image from your list of uploaded images. This could still work because I could still potentially generate this data list from the database. Does that make sense? Generate it at the time you see the page. But when you're dealing with databases, there may be some things you get to that are a little bit more advanced, where this may not necessarily work to send all of the list of options to the client. But if you can, if the list of options is small, this is great. One issue, though, that I do run into this, let's say I go ahead and type in cannelloni. There's no way to get the full suggestion list without erasing. So it doesn't really work the same way as a drop-down, if that makes sense. It still looks like a text field and still behaves like a text field, so I don't necessarily get all the same things that I might expect from a drop-down, which is why we're going to look at another tool. Okay. So that kind of concludes the options that we have for using autocomplete as far as what the browser features are that we can use. Okay. Now, one thing I want to talk before we leave that subject is how to deal with login information, because login information is kind of special. So if I want to build a login form, specifically what I need to do, and this depends on whether or not you have, that should actually say email there, whether you have an email or you have a username. So if I have your email address as your username, I'm going to say type email, autocomplete email, and I want to have that be name and ID email. That's going to force it all to work, because then anything that picks up on the autocomplete is going to know the right thing to put there, and anything that goes off of the ID or the name, such as LastPass, is going to know that that's what it needs to go. Similar thing here, I'm going to say that it's I type password, ID, name, password, current password. So that's what I want to set up. That's how I want to set up a login form. If I'm going by email address, if I'm going by username instead of email address, then I would change all of these to be username. This would be type text. Does that make sense? So username, 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 and type text. Okay. Now, that works for the login form. What about the register form? So you want to register an account. Okay. So if I want to register an account, there's a lot of tricks that I can use. Okay. So one trick that doesn't work, unfortunately, is setting autocomplete off. Okay. Because typically on a register form, I want to have you force you to fill in everything. As far as that's concerned, if you just naively built a register form, what it'll look like is a login form, because you have an email field and a password field, right? So because the browser doesn't know it's a register form, it's going to automatically fill in your email and password by default. If you don't do anything to your register form, it's going to autofill your email and password on your register form. That make sense? See where that might be a problem? It's autofilling that. So generally we want to prevent that. So a few things that I can do. So first of all, as far as the password field is, so where you enter the password and where you confirm the password, I'm going to give that autocomplete new password. Okay, and that's going to help basically with Chrome. That's what it means. I think, I'm not sure if Mozilla is up to date, Firefox up to date with that, but that's going to be what we need for that. Okay. The other thing that matters is how I've called these fields. So I said confirm password, and I said new password. So the ID in the name here is new password. The ID in the name here is confirm password. Okay? Because as long as I leave it as just password, LastPass will still fill it in. Does that make sense? Because LastPass is only looking at the name and the ID. So if I want to fool it to not fill in the password in the email, I do have to actually change these to be something else. Does that make sense? I have to change the name of the field to be new password instead of just being password. Is that clear? So it doesn't find it as long as it's that instead of calling it password. And then that's fine. I just say autocomplete email. That would still let it potentially fill in an email, but typically, as far as login information is concerned, it usually only populates both things if it can. The other hack that you'll see that I've got in here, the other workaround that I've got up here, is before this whole register form, before the actual register form, I've got two fields here. One's type email, one's type password. You see that? So that's to circumvent some browsers, or older versions of this worked on older versions of Chrome, that it would then go autofill into these hidden fields instead of it autofilling into the actual fields. Okay, and I haven't given them a name so that they're not sent to the server. Does that make sense? Because I didn't give them a name, they won't be sent to the server. It will autofill them, but not send those values to the server. You can't use type hidden there because it doesn't work. It doesn't work as a workaround because it's really looking for those types. But what you can do is you can use CSS to hide those fields. So you can't actually make them type hidden, but you can say display none and make it go away, and that still works. So this is one workaround for, so as far as that goes, kind of looking at the tips and tricks. So new password is the thing to remember to put on your password fields if you don't want to autofill. You can also add a hidden form like that, hidden pair of fields. The important thing is that if you're going to do this trick, they have to be before the action. Because browsers that are tricked by this, they always go to the first one on the page. They'll go to the first one they see. If the fake one's before the actual one, then that works. And then finally, the full LastPass. None of those things fools LastPass. You have to actually change the ID and the name of the field to new password instead of just password. So, questions there? Can you see what I'm doing here? So I've got the first one, which is here's the login form I want you to autofill versus a register form I don't want it to autofill. Does that make sense? The distinction there? So some forms on your page you may want it to autofill, some forms on your page you don't want it to autofill.
So we will autofill the first type of email then, and not the second?
So some browsers will. Chrome used to be fooled by this. It's not fooled by that anymore. That's where this new password comes in, is the full Chrome. I can't remember for sure, but I think Firefox is still fooled by this fake login form. Last I checked. So that's why we end up employing all these tools, just to make sure the most possible browsers don't autofill that information. Because one trick fools one browser at a given time, another trick fools another browser at a given time. So you just have to have all those tricks in your package. I have seen it get down to a point where sometimes you have to use JavaScript to go in and clear it out, but that's usually something you want to avoid as much as possible, is using JavaScript to remove autofill, because that creates more problems. Okay, so looking at jQuery UI. Does anybody remember talking about jQuery UI in your first semester? Just by a show of hands? Do you remember this? You do? Anybody else here?
I remember about them, if you remember what.
Okay, so let's go look at their website real quick. Let me pull that up. So looking at jQuery UI, you can get to it here. If you'll notice, there's the tab bar up here. I can get to jQuery Right from there, I can go to jQuery UI. So they are really closely related, okay? So, but they're two separate libraries. So jQuery is a library to deal with manipulating the DOM and all the stuff we've already seen, right, with doing animations and this and that. What jQuery UI is, it's a plugin on top of jQuery. So in order to use jQuery UI, you have to have jQuery. Does that make sense? You have to install both, and you have to install jQuery before jQuery UI. All clear? So it kind of plugs in just like Bootstrap plugs into jQuery. Okay? So what jQuery UI does is it gives us a bunch of standard sort of controls, what we call widgets, that we can use online to do more advanced things than just standard input controls would allow us to do. So if you look on the left, you'll see that there's a bunch of these widgets here. So like there's a accordion widget, which will look like that. So there's a lot of different tools, a lot of different user interface bits that we can use out of the box that they built. Does that make sense? Some of these, there's a version in Bootstrap, and where possible, I'd say the version in Bootstrap, use that instead. So for instance, they have dialogues as well, but their dialogues are not nearly as good as Bootstrap's dialogues, or not as configurable. So I'd still recommend using those. It is a little bit dated in a lot of ways, in the sense that jQuery UI is not nearly as easy to style as Bootstrap is, but and part of that is because it's older. jQuery UI is a lot older than Bootstrap, and there's several of those. So the one we want to look at today is the one called Autocomplete. Okay, so for instance, if you go to the Autocomplete widget, they've got a bunch of examples here. You can see them on the left. So I'm just looking at that first example, which is the default functionality. They kind of give you a hint down here as to how this works. But if I start typing in letters, you see how it's suggested different things. So I can start typing in text, and it will give me suggestions based on what I've typed in. Does that make sense? So that's what it does for me. Now, that's just the basic version. Okay, so that's default functionality. There's a bunch of these other examples in here. So for instance, if I wanted to look at one down here that says multiple values, what this one's got built into it is actually lets me do more than one keyword separated by commas. So if I wanted to say, type in C, go pick C++, you see it's already put the comma in there, and I want to say Java, right? That might be something that's really good if you're, for instance, typing in tags, right? It can give you a selection of the existing tags, the tags that you can pick, and go ahead and help you pick those. So that's there, and you can use a similar sort of setup to do multiple keyword searching. And the basic code, if we go up to default functionality, down here at the bottom, there's a section called, this button called View Source. If we click on that, it'll expand, and we can see the code that actually went into that. So to make this autocomplete work is actually pretty simple. And in fact, it works with any type of input that I have. So here we have just a basic text input. That's all you start with. Notice that there's no fancy CSS. There's no anything actually applied to the input tag itself. Does that make sense? It's just a text field. What we do in order to give it that autocomplete function is we use first a jQuery selector to select it. So we're going to select it by ID, and then we call this autocomplete method on it. So calling the autocomplete method on it turns it from a regular text box to a text box that supports autocomplete. Supports our special autocomplete. And specifically, the only value I have to give it is this one called source. Okay? So in this case, source is just a JavaScript array. here I've specified all the languages. And I said, okay, here's your array. Use that as the options that you can auto-suggest. That's as simple as it is to just say, hey, I've got these array of things. I want you to suggest the user. Go for it. Questions there?
So is the commas, is that the only thing like different from using data lists instead of that? Or?
So the commas is another example. So this is just the basic, simple one keyword example. If I want to go look at the comma, the one with multiple values, I'm going to go over here and look at the code. There's a little bit more code here to deal with that one, as you may see. And there's actually, to be honest, I think there's a lot more code in there that needs to be. The biggest thing that happens is they're using this extract last. And specifically, they're saying, go get the last thing in what you've typed in and use that as the suggestion instead of using all the text, because by default it uses all the text. So it says, well, when you do the autocomplete, only use the part that's since the last comma. And there's a little regex here to take care of that. So we split it based on that regex, which is a comma followed by a sequence of 0 or more white space characters, similar like what we just did, right? So /s here in JavaScript is still white space characters. A star is still 0 or more. And this comma is just literally a comma. So as long as it's separated by that, it'll split it up. So you can kind of read through the code, see how that functions. But yes, the basic version is very, very similar to data lists, right? The basic, simple, out-of-the-box version is very, very similar to data list. It doesn't do really anything more than that. But the one that we really want this for is this example. If I go look up remote data source, this one is actually pulling from a web service. So this one is for birds. So let me see. If I type in SP, I think that gives me a few options. There we go. And you saw the progress bar as I typed things in there, as it was going and fetching it from the web service, right? So this is actually sending the term that you type in, whatever characters you type in, to the internet, and then getting back a list of JSON strings. So it sends that as a query parameter called term, and it gets back as a JSON list of strings. And that's all it needs. So as long as you can build a web service that takes a single input, which is a string, and returns a list of strings, an array of strings, you're good. You can make that work with this. Does that make sense? So that becomes a lot more powerful because that means that with this, we can now go back to the database dynamically using Ajax and go look things up in the database. Or we can also do things like spell checking, which we can't easily do in the client side just because it requires so much resources to do spell checking. So it's easier to send that off to a web service and have the web service do the spell checking. So jumping back here, so that's kind of where we're going to use that for, is really we're going to use that to hook up a web service. If I just had a list, well then I just use data list. If I just know the values, it's easier to hook that up that way. So the way that we get jQuery UI installed, remember that jQuery only requires a script. It doesn't have a style sheet. Okay? jQuery only has a script. So we can grab, but jQuery UI needs a script and a style sheet. And because that drop-down requires some CSS to work. So we've got the style sheet here, we've got the script here. Now let me show you real quickly where I got these though, just so you know. Definitely you can just copy in from this handout, but I want to make sure you know where I got these from. So code.jQuery UI, code.jQuery.com is where you actually find this. You won't find these links on the jQuery, jQuery UI website itself, actually. So you'll need to know to go to codejQuery.com. Similarly to installing jQuery, you want to make sure you're doing this as HTTPS. So if you have HTTPS in your URL, you'll end up getting a script fragment that's HTTPS. If you have HTTP up here in your URL, it'll end up giving you one as HTTP. So just know that you're going to need to do that. So jQuery core here, this is where I grab that regular, the base just jQuery library. I grab the minified version here. You'll also notice though if I scroll down, there is jQuery UI. So if I want jQuery UI, I can get the script here. So that gives me a link to the script from that CDN. That's where I can get that. And then underneath here, do you see all these themes? So there's a bunch of themes that have different colorations that you can use with jQuery UI. But the simplest one is just this base theme. So if I click on base, it's going to open up the script file here. So the thing I know that I need is there's the URL for the script tag. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm going to put in here. That's where I got that from. So this is just the base theme. If you wanted to use a different theme, you could go here and grab it. So let's say I wanted Dark Hive. I would then use this URL up here. There is not a minified version for the themes. So, unfortunately. If you wanted a minified version, you'd need to download it and minify it yourself. So, that's how we set that up. So we need a style sheet in the head and a script at the end of the body. And remember that this script needs to come after jQuery. Okay? Script needs to be after jQuery because it depends on jQuery. On another note, you also need to have this script in here. Where do you think you need to have that? Remember, we have other scripts in our head. We have a bootstrap, style sheet. We have our bootstrap style sheet, and we have maybe our main CSS, right? Where do you think that this should land?
Above the main CSS.
Okay.
Or the main should be below jQuery.
The main should be below jQuery? Why would you say that? Or yeah. So effectively you're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Effectively you're saying the same thing.
You don't want the jQuery to override your main JavaScript.
Correct. So I definitely don't want it after main because then it would override main. So main should always be last because I want main to override everything else. Okay? I also need to put bootstrap in there somewhere, right? Well, one thing to remember about bootstrap, you may have heard this mentioned at some point. Remember that there is something called a reset script, a reset style sheet. Bootstrap has one built in. So anything you put before Bootstrap is likely not to work because it's going to reset it. So pretty much for sure, you always put Bootstrap as the first style sheet because it's going to reset everything else. Okay, so you always put Bootstrap first, you always put main last, which means that we're going to put jQuery UI in between here. Does that make sense? They need to be in that order because main needs to override everything and Bootstrap is going to reset everything. So that needs to be first, main needs to be last. And that puts jQuery UI in the middle. Okay, so we're going to add those things. If we want to actually hook this up, we did kind of look at this previously. So if I wanted to hook this up as give me the favorite pasta, kind of using this jQuery UI instead of using a data list, I would specify it here in an array, and then I would say hashtag favorite pasta, autocomplete, source, available pastas. Okay. I might also put in there comma min length 0. Min length says, what's the minimum number of characters I have to type in before it starts giving me suggestions. So typically if I just have a list like this, I'm going to set that min length as 0. Okay. Now on the other hand, if I want to pull from a web service, it looks very similarly. It's going to look like this. So I still say favorite pasta, autocomplete, and I'm going to specify the source here. I'm going to specify the source as being a URL instead of being a list, instead of being an array. So it's going to dynamically go out to that URL. So this would be like the pasta controller and the names action method, right? So this would be my web service.
So it's using Ajax.
It does use Ajax. Yeah, so it uses Ajax behind the scenes. This is all you have to write, and it'll go ahead and do the Ajax for you. But yes, it is using Ajax to do that. Which means you can also troubleshoot it by looking at the network tab, which is usually where you're going to find your errors, is going with the browser's network tab. So that's what it's going to go out to. Typically, you want to set a min length of greater than 0 if you're using a web service, because you don't want it to hit all the time. You only want to hit once you start typing in enough characters, right? So a common kind of config there is you usually say min length 2, so that it doesn't start going to get things from the server until you've typed at least 2 characters in, and that reduces the number of search results that it brings back, which means it also significantly reduces the load on your server. That makes sense? So that's a good general practice, is to put min length 2. Did you have a question, Dalton? Okay. Does that make sense? So this is how we do it for just hey, I've got an array in JavaScript. Here's how I do it if I want to hook up to a web service. Okay? So now, how do we build that web service? Okay? Let's think about how we might build that web service. So I know that the signature for that has to be what? I know that it has to be in the pasta controller, but what does the signature have to be for the names method? Well, it has to be public, for sure. It needs to return an action result. I'm going to do this just synchronous to keep it simple on the board instead of doing it as async. So action result, even though I can do it asynchronous. So names, and then remember it needs to take a string, which is the term. It's what the user's typed in, and it specifically has to be called term. If you don't call that input variable term, this will not work. Because it will always, this jQuery UI always sends it as term. Okay. If you set it as X or Q or whatever, then this is always going to be null. You won't get the value that the user typed in. But otherwise, this is going to get you whatever currently in the text field. Okay. So inside there, let's say I've got my pastas table, right? So what do I need to do to go get the list of pastas that match that term?
Return a JSON result of an object of pastas.
Okay, so that's going to be down here. Where do I start? What's line 1? I need to get some pastas, right? So let's get some pastas. So I'm going to say var pasta is equal to db dot pastas. Similar to what we were looking at the beginning of this, I probably need a where clause of some sort, right? So I'm going to say where what? When we get the pasta names, yeah. So that would be like x.name, right? Yeah. What's next? contains, okay. The pasta name contains,
Shouldn't be pasta name, it should be term. No, wait, no, yeah, it is name.
yeah, it is name. What's next? So, be term, right? So I'm going to say the name of the pasta contains the term that you typed in. Or specifically, if I type in CA, then I'm going to get anything that contains CA. Does that make sense? So it would say where that, and then I'd want to say all I want on these objects is just the name attribute, right? So what method can I use to just pick off the name and throw all the other columns away?
Select.
I can. Yep, select will do that. Somebody else tell me what goes in there though. So I just want to pick off the names of the pasta. I want to throw all the other columns away.
Name.
Just write name.
No, X, arrow.
X arrow X dot name, right? So if I write it like this, and in fact I might just call this query. So that will give me all the names of the pasta that I need, all the names of the pasta that contain what I typed in. And then I can return that. So I can say return JSON. If I just return the query, it's going to go ahead and turn that in. This is effectively IEnumerable or iQueryable name. I mean iQueryable string. This is going to return this as a JSON array of strings. The other thing I need to do in there is I need to say JSON behavior dot allow get. The reason is that this web service is going to be called over a get method, over a get request. And so if I don't allow get, we'll get an error when we try to call this. And it won't work. So does that make sense?
Okay, so it's a get request, so you have to put HTTP get in as an attribute?
No. If I put HTTP get up at the top, that says it's only allowable as get.
Okay.
So this says it can be used as get. If I don't decorate it with a type, then that means that this method can be called as get, post, put, whatever. That's what putting the thing on the top says. It says it only can be called through this method. Does that make sense? So in this case, I don't care. It can be called between get or post. Either way, I'm returning the same result. Does that make sense? That's why I'm not going to decorate it.
What if you had like a delete?
He would still call this. Yeah, if I send it as a delete request, it would still call this, because if I don't decorate it with anything, then it's valid for any method. And that's the default. Default comes with any method. So that way, this can be called either as get or post. So you can see what's happening there. There I've got a web service, does the same thing as what I had there as a JSON array. But now I have the database involved. Does that make sense? Simple as that to hook up a database to it. Okay. Now, that works as long as, actually let me leave that light on a minute. So this works as long as I'm just doing one column like this. And it's simple, it's just a name. Okay. Things get a little bit more interesting if I wanted, for instance, to say, look at more than one table or more than one column, or specifically want to look at tags and suggest a tag. So I want to go through how to do this specifically. Oh, just a note here. You can look at this kind of page. This will show you specifically where these things should go. So that's where the style sheet should go, and this is where the jQuery script should generally go. So that'll kind of give you an idea of the order that things should be in.
So like if you do it with the like autocomplete widget,
Yep.
The ID, is that just to a regular text box? Like in the HTML?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so all of those, if we're using a jQuery UI, that plugin, this is all going to be with just a regular text box that we're starting with, and then we're adding this drop down to. So that's basically where that starts. Snapshot of that. That's it. Okay. So that's where I would start if I wanted to just have a name. I'll come back to those things. So if I want to work with tags specifically, so I want to say suggest the tags for these pasta, like it's soft and squishy, or it's curly, or things like that. I might want to do this a little bit different. So let's say I want to do this just as the tags. Okay? So we would start in a similar fashion. So rather than saying I want to get the name, I would start with I want to get the tags. Does that make sense? I'm going to get any pasta where their tags contains what I typed in, and then grab all their tags, right? But if I just return this back to the user, this is going to be, okay, I'm going to see if this pasta has 3 tags, it's going to be tasty, salty, and curly, right, as commas, right? That's not what I want to return to the user. I don't want to return all the tags. I just want to break it up into individual tags, right? So in order to do that, to do the breaking up, I can't do that in SQL. So I have to get this into C# land, okay? So how do I get this into C# land? ToList, right? So at the end of this, I'm going to call .toList. Okay? So if I do that, this query now is a list of strings. Does that make sense? This query is a list of strings. So I'm just going to write that here, change that so that it's clear. String. That's a list of strings. So what I want to do is for each of those strings, I want to break it up based on some sort of separator, right? So I want to break it up into multiple strings. So the way I'm going to handle that, I'm going to say var, let's say we'll call this split tags, or maybe I just call this tags. I'm going to say tags is equal to, we're going to start with the query, start with what I had up top, and I'm going to say what? Actually, it might be better if I called this pastas instead, because this is really more pastas. So I'm going to call this pastas. Pastas. Okay. Now, we've seen select. Okay. Select says, take this, transform it into another thing. In this case, I need to actually use a method that we haven't used yet that's part of link. And it's actually called select many. So what select many does, it allows you to kind of say, I'm going to take this one input. This one input's actually going to generate multiple outputs, right? So for each string that I feed into here, I'm actually going to get multiple strings out, but I want to build that into a single list of strings. That make sense? So every pasta maps to multiple tags. So I'm going to say select many. And in here, I'm going to say, now remember what type X is at this point. X is a string. So I'm going to say X, actually I'm going to say regex split. So regex dot split. And I'm going to split that string. So in this case, that's just X because passes is really just a list of strings. Okay? If I had something more complicated, this might still be X dot tags. Okay? But in this case, it's just going to be X. Okay? So the next thing I need is that regular expression. So it's definitely going to start with a nav. Okay? And you remember what I used previously. I used /s plus, which had said one or more white space characters, right? But these are not separated by just white space characters, right? Our tags are not just separated by white space. What else are they separated by? Commas, right? They're probably separated by commas. So I need to separate them not just by white space, but also by commas. So the regex that I would put here is going to look like this. So I'm going to say /s. So it could start with white space. And then I'm going to say star, which remember star is 0 or more of those characters. So it might have white space after the word but before the comma. And then the comma, and similar /s star, that's what I'm going to use as my regular expression. So it may be that there's extra white space in there with the commas as well. So there could be white space before the comma, there could be white space after the comma, all depending on how the user typed in the text. So that's the reason that I have this here before and after. Before and after. Does that make sense? So that's how I'm going to split that up. I need another one to close off the select many. Does that make sense? The reason I'm using select many is this maps one string to a list of strings. It's not a one-to-one, it's a one-to-many. So it's going to combine each of those lists and put them all together. Okay. So that's how I break up the tokens. I ended up with a single list of all those tags. Now I end up with an interesting problem here, because I now have tags that don't match my search term. Why is that? This list here of tags is going to have tags that don't match my search term. Brandon? Thoughts? So at this point, tags will contain tags that don't actually match my term. So say my term is, I typed in sweet. There might be things in here that don't contain sweet. I need another where, right? If I think about it though, the why, which is what I'm trying to get to. So let's say that I had something that was tags, and it was sweet, comma spicy, comma soft, right? Those are my tags, right? If I search for sweet, I should only get sweet from this. Does that make sense? I shouldn't get spicy and soft. But because all of this came out, okay, I had a kind of pasta that had all three of those tags, So that's still past this where clause up here. Does that make sense? That had sweet somewhere in it, it passed it, even though now here I've got it split up as sweet, spicy, and soft, and now spicy and soft don't match, don't have sweet. Does that make sense? So originally here they were all together, here they're no longer. Okay? So I need another where. Okay? So I'm going to say where, and I'm going to say x arrow x dot contains term. So note up here I said x dot tags because I was working with pasta objects. Here I just said x because I'm just working with strings. Does that make sense? See that? Okay. Now one question, so I need this where here for sure. Do I have to have that where up there as well? So show of hands, who thinks we need that where up there? Okay. Who thinks we don't need that where, the first where? Okay. So from the people that think that we need it, you two that think we need it, why do we need it? Why do we need the first where?
Narrow it down to the three.
Narrow it down for what?
To the three search terms.
Well, we're gonna narrow it. You're right in terms of narrowing it down. There's something we're doing with narrowing it down. All right. Essen, what do you think?
I don't know, something really changed my mind because I was looking at it and seeing that we already calling the variable tag equals to like pasta dot select menu, and then we already got the contains in there and the term, so.
So I've already got a where down here, right?
Yeah. I was kind of looking, it didn't seem.
So Graham, you said we don't need the first where. Why is that?
Because you can just do it on the second one. Like, why would you need that one?
Okay.
First.
But you're right. This, if I remove that one, I will still get the right answer. If I only have the second where here, I will get the right answer.
I think that you don't need it, and that if you removed it, you'll still get the same results. But I still think you should keep the dot where, because that's the first one is a call to the database, while the second isn't.
Exactly. So this one happens in C#, this one happens in SQL. So this one prevents how much data I pull from the database.
Like,
If I don't put this where here, I'm pulling every pasta from the database. Right? If I don't have this where, I'm going to have every pasta from the database in memory, versus if I do have that there, I'll only have some of the pastas, which then I can throw away the extra tags down here. I still have to throw away the extra tags one way or the other, but I can reduce how many pastas I actually pull from the database. Does that make sense? So rather than pulling 1,000,000 pastas, I can pull 100 pastas. Makes a big difference in terms of performance. So that's why I'm going to have both of those things there. So it's really a performance thing. It's not a correctness thing. One catch, one big gotcha here, though. So this is running in C. This is running in C#. This is running in SQL. This one is case insensitive. This one is not. It's a problem. So how can I solve that so that this one's case insensitive?
you could, on x dot contains term, you could use a dot to lower.
I could use a dot to lower. Will that solve it? Will that be enough? So if I say x dot to lower dot contains, term. So if I extend that, okay, so that'll be lowercase. The tag will be lowercase, but is that enough? What happens if I type in the search term all uppercase? What happens if I type in sweet all uppercase? Will this still give me back sweet? It won't. Okay. Why not? So Scott, you said it won't. Huh?
Wouldn't you put two lower on both of them?
On both of them. Okay, so what both of them? So I said the tag lower, what's the other thing I need to make lower?
Well, both word clauses.
Huh?
Both word clauses in there.
This one I don't need to. That one's okay.
Oh.
But there is something else I need to make lowercase. I need to make both things I'm comparing lowercase, right? So what's the other thing? What am I comparing to this tag with sort max?
Doesn't contains have like other parameters you could include, like an options one for case insensitive?
Compared to does, contains does not, unfortunately. At least if I remember right, it doesn't. I might be wrong, where it has an ordinal kind of thing where you can tell it. But assuming I don't have that access, assuming I don't have access to it, assuming I'm going to do too lower. What am I comparing? Well, I'm comparing x and term. Can you see that? Term is the other thing I'm comparing it with. Term is the thing that user typed in, right? So right now I'm not considering the case of what the user typed in. This works as long as the user types in everything lowercase, but it doesn't work if they type in anything uppercase. So I need to say up at the top, I'm going to say term is equal to term dot to lower. So if the first thing I do in this function is I make the term lowercase, then it'll be lowercase, both things will be lowercase down here. Does that make sense?
So the select many, it'll still keep the casing?
Yes. All it's doing, well, select many just says, okay, I've got some transformation that's taking a single string into one thing into multiple things, and it's combining that into one list. And then here I can finally say return. And I'm going to say return JSON tags, and then that would be the allow get. Does that make sense? You can see where that's a little bit different. If we're dealing with tags, I have to do a little bit more finagling with the data because it's effectively multiple values in a single column. And that's where this part is basically the same as the name, but this was, okay, I just split it and then where it. Okay. So we'll look at this tomorrow and we'll do this with, because we'll have both categories and tags that we'd ideally want to suggest the user. So we'll look at this exact code tomorrow when we go through the sports store and try to kind of combine those two pieces, which is what I've got here. So then the way that works in JavaScript, if I'm writing this out in a view, remember the thing I want to put here is going to be, so this is pastas, this would be url.action, and it would be names. Does that make sense? So rather than hard coding like /pasta/names, just like we did with, working with Ajax, I'm going to actually put url.action there instead. Okay. Does that make sense? You see what's going on there? So we use jQuery UI with the web service to then return results dynamically and actually access the database and do all sorts of fancy things there. It also, in that process, it's not unusual for the users to misspell words. So, for instance, if I kept this system, right? I kept this system and the user types in SWT, they're not going to get any results. Or if they type in SWET, well, they're really close to sweet, but they're not going to get any suggestion because they have a typo in their spelling. Does that make sense? So a lot of times it's worth integrating a spell checker into this process and say, well, what you typed in looks like it's really close to this. Do you mean this? Because if I strictly go matches exactly or contains, which is what I'm doing here, it still doesn't handle errors in spelling. You see that? So having a spell checker built in is really helpful. I had a little bit of trouble getting a spell checker working on C#. I'll show you the one that I did get working, but there are a few out there. As far as if you just go look NuGet packages, look for spell check, there's a few of those that don't work, and there's one of those that needs, the license is $300 per person. It's pretty crazy. For a single project, I'm like, no, I'm not going to spend $300 just to get a spell checker. Commonly, as far as doing spell checking, we use what's called natural language processing tools, or NLP. So there's a bunch of libraries out there that have that built into it. Some of them actually have spell checking tools built into those tools. So for instance, when I was working with Node.js, there's a package called Natural, and it has a spell checker in it actually, which is nice. But I wasn't able to find that same spell check in some of the NLP packages that are available out there for C#. So the algorithm that we use for spell checking is something called the Levenstein's distance metric. And specifically what it does is it tracks, you kind of count up how many characters are different between the word you typed in versus the word that's valid. So for instance, if I type in SWT, how many characters away are these two words, SWT and sweet? They're 2, right? I need to insert 2 characters. So the distance here would be 2. If I wanted to go from SWT to soft, how many characters different is that?
2 characters.
It's also 2 characters, right? Well, what are those 2 characters? I need to maybe insert an O and replace a W with an F, right? So I can do insertion, deletions, replacements, or swaps. And depending on how you set up that formula, those different kind of changes can have a different weight. They can have a different cost, which is why I might want to make that a different, which here I might want to make that a different cost, because otherwise I'm looking at this and it's just as likely that you meant to say sweet or soft, right? But which one did I probably meant to see? Did I probably mean? I probably meant sweet. So I probably might make the cost of inserting a letter maybe a little bit lower. Does that make sense? So if I say replacing a letter costs 0.5, then this is a distance of 1 and that's a distance of 2. Or 1.5, because that's an insertion as well. So that's a common tool that we'll use, is we'll measure how different is it from a known word. And that's how most of these spell checkers work. So in order to have these spell checkers work, in order to do that measurement of distance, we have to know what words are valid. And what tells us what words are valid is we use a dictionary. Okay? So a dictionary has a list of, here are all the words that are valid. Okay, look at the words you give me, see if it's in the dictionary, or find a word that's close to the dictionary. So this always requires a dictionary file of some sort. So specifically, if I'm working with this in a more constrained, like I'm looking for products, it might be worth it for me to build a dictionary that specifically only has the words that I'm using, right? So let's say I'm using tags as my thing I want them to be entering, right? I might make a dictionary that only has the tags that are valid. And that way the spell checker will suggest those tags. That make sense? So you can use the entire American dictionary for the spell checker, but that usually doesn't get you great results when you want something specific. Does that make sense? But the way I'm going to show you how to do this is not to create your own dictionary. Just, hey, let's use the US dictionary, because that's a lot easier to set up. But that's a thing to keep in mind, is you probably, if you're really using this, you want to make your own dictionary of words. Okay? So the basic process of getting this set up is you install this package. It's going to be nHunspell. Hunspell is the spell checker that's used by OpenOffice and LibreOffice. I think it's also used by Chrome as well. So it's a very kind of popular spell checker. nHunspell is a port of that to C#. So we'll download that. There's some dictionary files we need to get then. I went ahead and downloaded the ones from LibreOffice. If you look under handouts, there's a file called dictionary files. It's a zip file. It's got those two files that you need, the AFF and the dic file. Okay. You'll need to drop those into this folder because that's where it's going to look for it. There's also 2 DLLs that come in when you install this NuGet package. You're going to have to manually add those to Git. And again, we'll look at this tomorrow when we actually go through that. But we have to manually add those to Git, otherwise they won't be uploaded. And your system won't work. It won't work if somebody else tries to use it. So we'll need to manually add those to Git. And then here's kind of what the code ends up looking like. So I create this spelling object. I say new Hunspell. I have to tell it where to find those files. So here I'm just giving it the file names. I could also give it a path to the files. But I'm going to tell it here's where to get the files, create the spell checker, and then I'm going to ask for suggestions. So build the list of suggestions of how I might spell it differently. So what worked out best for me in kind of testing around with it is first to check, is it valid? So .spell says, is this a valid word or a misspelled word? If it's a valid word, then I just say, well, my suggestion is just keep the word that you've already given me. Just say, okay, that's the list of, that's my suggestion, is just keep that word. If not, if there's an error, then I'm going to say suggest, give me your best suggestions of what word it might be, and I'm going to take the top 5. Reason I take the top 5, that actually tends to give me a lot of results back, and so just sending all of them back is just way too much. The scroll bar just goes on for way too long for it to be helpful, so I just send back only the most recent 5. Fair forewarning, Hunspell doesn't really sort them all that well as far as what's the closest thing, so that's not always the best. You might want to say, give me the last 10 or whatever, but the idea is you probably don't want to give it back all the results. You want to give back a limited number. And then finally, what I do to add that into the search is I use something called union. Union is a link method, and what it does is it combines 2 lists. So I want to say this followed by that. So if I do a union, it will combine those 2 lists and concatenate them. So in this case, it'll put my suggestions and then the keyword list that I built previously.
So it's like appending a list.
Yeah, it's basically like appending a list. That's what union does. You kind of think of it that way. It's combine these results with those results to make one massive list. So that's how we'll set up spell checking. That's all the code there actually is to it. It's pretty simple. There's obviously a lot more to it if you were going to build your own spell checker. but to use one off the shelf is fairly straightforward. Another thing that's out there, we won't talk about this in this class because it's out of scope. There's something out there called Apache Solr, and it runs as a separate server. So you have your web server that's running your website. You run Apache Solr as a separate server, and that just handles searches like this. So you feed it the data as far as what data you have in your database, and it builds up kind of a clever list of, okay, here's all the words that you have that you could search for, and help building you those suggestions. And that has a lot of this stuff already built in. So that in a enterprise in a real world is a really good solution, is to spin up a completely separate server that does that well. There's also services that you can pay for that will do that kind of thing. So that's usually what ends up in a real world, is you can hijack that off to another server to do just that searching, because it's such a specialized thing. But I wanted to give you some tools to see how those things fit together, and so you can kind of build those systems yourself, where you just need a simple sort of setup. Okay, so that's all I have as far as theory goes. Again, we've written some code on the board, we've seen some code on here, but we haven't actually put this to use yet. So I want to kind of go through, tomorrow we'll look at the sports store and we'll take this all together and try to make that work. So to kind of review the stuff we talked about today, we talked about first the multiple keyword searching. I gave you some code for that, and the code that you have there is basically, it's a recipe, right? You can use that to build the keyword searching into anything. You just kind of follow the basic outline. And then we talked about the details of how that works. We talked a little bit more about deferred execution. I gave you some resources more for that. And then we talked about HTML5, the new autocomplete and autofill stuff that's out there. That stuff's very helpful, and especially for registration forms, especially for checkout and filling in your shipping information and all those kind of things. Those are really important. And then we talked finally how to use the jQuery UI widget to build a more advanced search with the web service on the back end and Ajax. So that's kind of the broad scheme of everything we went over. Questions?
I downloaded the Unspell Master.
Yep. You said what? Hunspell Master?
How do you say that? Unspell?
It's N